From the Zimmerman Symphony Center in Canton, Ohio, this is Orchestrating Change. I'm Matthew Jenkins Yarashevitz, Associate Conductor of the Canton Symphony Orchestra.
And I'm Rachel Hagemeyer, Manager of Education and Community Engagement.
Welcome to Season 3 of our podcast. We are so glad you could join us.
This podcast navigates issues that exist in the field of classical music and the world at large. We invite you to listen with open ears as our guests share their experiences and as we discuss these often avoided topics.
Today, we welcome conductor Tiffany Chang to our podcast. Originally trained in the world of music education, Chang holds positions at both Oberlin Conservatory and Berklee College of Music, and previously served as interim director of orchestras at Baldwin Wallace Conservatory and Boston University. Lately, her focus has been geared more toward the professional realm, particularly in the world of opera, where she serves as director of the North End Music and Performing Arts Center's Opera Project in Boston and has major engagements this season with Opera Columbus here in Ohio, as well as the Portland Opera in Oregon. She also runs the blog Conductor as CEO, which examines job satisfaction issues in the orchestral industry and the role of the conductor in creating a healthy workplace culture. Tiffany Chang, welcome to Orchestrating Change.
Thank you, Matthew and Rachel. It is a pleasure to be here, and I'm so excited for this conversation.
Yeah, it's very exciting. I know you a little bit. I've been able to, he mentioned Baldwin Wallace Conservatory. I was there when you were conducting. You actually taught me how to conduct. I don't know if I remember much, but I did learn from you. But we would love to learn a little more about you. So if you wouldn't mind telling us just a little bit about yourself and your childhood and how music kind of inspired you as a kid and how it played a part in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have always played music since I was young, but never very seriously. So I started on the piano when I was maybe like 5 or 6. And my major instrument is actually the cello. And I didn't pick that up until actually middle school, which is actually rather late for a string player. And, as I said, I played music, but I was never very serious. I never really considered it as a career path until actually fairly late in my high school years. And it was a summer at the Tanglewood Music Institute in the Boston University Tanglewood Institute, which I attended as a high school cellist, that really made me think that music and inspiring people through music was a path for me. And I made that distinction, that realization fairly late. So I wasn't preparing for auditions. I wasn't thinking about music school, none of that. So I think that the path that my musical path came about as a matter of circumstance. So, and I think that my entire career has unfolded as a matter of circumstance. So I really believe that things happen for a reason, and I'm here for a reason. I've done the things that I've done, and I will do the things that I will do for a reason. And that is kind of how music intertwined with my life.
Yeah.
So I can totally relate to this because I am a conductor as well. And when I left high school, I figured I was going to become an engineer or a PhD scientist or something like that. And so like you, I wasn't preparing for auditions or anything. I didn't take any auditions as an undergraduate. And I went to school and fell in love with conducting on a sheer accident, essentially. And many years later, here we are. So yeah, I can totally relate. So you originally pursued music education at the undergraduate and master's level, I believe, but then you got your DMA in conducting as a performer. What led you to transition sort of from the music education path to the performance conducting path?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think my path to conducting is not a straight shot. And I went to school for music education. My undergrad was in music education and cello performance. And I had always thought that I wanted to teach music. And I wasn't sure in which context I want to teach music. I didn't know where my career would necessarily fall, but I was always interested in inspiring people with how I taught or how I interacted or how I performed. And also in my undergrad, I had the opportunity to study other areas that I was really interested in. So for example, I pursued a minor in composition and a minor in music theory. So I was doing a lot of things, and I realized that I liked doing all of those things. Like I really liked studying scores, and like, to use like an engineer analogy, like I love reverse engineering a score. Like I love looking at it and ask questions of why did the composer do this, why didn't they do that instead. And so I was really interested in composition. I was really interested in studying an analysis, which brought me to music theory. And I was really interested in performance as a cellist, and I was really interested in teaching / inspiring. So I kind of fell into conducting as the thing that allowed me to do all of those things. It allowed me to study, it allowed me to be a nerd, and it allowed me to inspire, it allowed me to perform, and it allowed me to teach in one form or another. So, as I delve more into conducting, I realized that I enjoy the challenge of being a leader, of making an impact.
By the way, really quickly, I can relate to all of your reasons for becoming a conductor. I feel the same way. I love nerding out, just opening a score and see how it's put together and inspiring the musicians and inspiring the audience. I love every aspect of it, and I'm so blessed to do it.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Listening to both of you talk about it, I was like, there's a lot of similarities here, because I've now both of you kind of talk about this, and it's really interesting. And you both have had interesting paths into conducting, different than someone who maybe in high school is like, I want to be a conductor. And for you, Tiffany, you're also in a field where there's not a lot of women at high levels of conducting. There's quite a few female conductors. They exist. There's a lot of them. But at the highest levels, when we look at our major orchestras, we just don't see that. Did that ever come into your mind as you made this switch to pursue it? Did it ever deter you? Does it still kind of play in your mind space today as you're pursuing this?
That's a really interesting question, because I think it's a question that plagues a lot of female conductors. But honestly, the gender aspect never deterred me. However, if you replaced female with academic in your question, and there are not that many academic conductors working at a high level in this industry, did that deter you and that the answer is a resounding yes, and yes, and yes, and yes, and yes, and yes, yes, yes. I cannot say yes. I cannot say it as many. I cannot say it more times. And that's, I think, something that I've continued to be frustrated with in the industry. That because of my resume and my current experience in my career, having been mostly in the academic world, that I've been frustrated with how the industry generally associates my worth, my abilities, and my potential contribution based on my resume. And I think that there is a real stigma towards academic conductors at all levels, collegiate or secondary school, or in public schools, who gets labeled and pigeonholed and othered within the profession. So that's kind of what I've had to deal with.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I remember this conversation in Conservatory of some some people holding the opinion that those who were pursuing degrees in music education would not be as good at performance as those who were pursuing degrees in performance. And that was so false. Our first chair trumpet player, Cassidy, it was the best, and she's a music educator. And I think that that's really interesting that you say that, because I don't know. I would think that it takes a lot of talent and a lot of skill to be an academic conductor and to both teach and then produce a high quality product. Why do you, I'm wondering why that stigma exists maybe.
Yeah. Well, Rachel, you're so right in mentioning that this stigma exists also in the instrumental performance space as well, because it is not just within conducting, and I often forget that. So thank you for bringing that up. I have ideas about why this is, because I can definitely understand their positions, the industry's position for thinking this way. Because I think our first objective as people is to protect ourselves from danger and from risk. And when we're in charge of quality of a product, there's a lot of safety in familiarity, and there's less risk when you use the person that everybody thinks is, or the society thinks has a good track record. And that's something that I think as a society in any industry, it's really hard to let go of. And we don't think about it enough to start to make change happen in that regard. And I'd also go as far as saying that it is easier to stick to the status quo than it is to go against it, because it's hard to go against the status quo. And so as a result, there's a bias that exists. And I think it exists in all branches of our industry and also in other industries too. What's really interesting is that I've heard from someone who's outside of the music industry say that it's interesting that the academic professionals in the music industry are not seen to be as high performing as the professionals in the industry, whereas in other industries it's kind of the opposite, in that if you are a professor at a university, you are highly regarded, and that's just it. And it's just interesting for me to hear that comment from someone who is not living in my world and who doesn't see what I see. And that makes me also just think more about why there's a stigma and how we can overcome it. And I think that the first problem is that there's no conversation about it. There's so much conversation about the women conductors and supporting that group of people, and I haven't really heard anything about how do we support and level the playing field for the academic conductors. And I'm I feel like that I am from a camp that believes that excellent conducting is excellent conducting. And I feel like I believed that for a really long time. And maybe I'm stubborn to believe that, because maybe the society is just not catching up to that as quickly as I want to. But I wonder if it's ever going to catch up, and how I can adjust the way that I think about my career and where I wanted to go, given what the reality is in the profession.
Right. And, I have heard from, I want to say at least from the start of grad school, if you go into academia, you'll never work in the profession again. I have heard that. I heard that from the get-go, and the profession has always been my goal. And so hearing your experience a little bit farther along in your track than I am right now, hearing your experience, it doesn't surprise me at all. I was wondering also, something else that we've talked about a little bit that we've noticed is the preponderance of foreign-born conductors, specifically Europeans, at the head of many major American orchestras. There are, of the League of American Orchestras Tier 1 budget level, there are only 3 Americans out of over 30 orchestras, and 2 of them had very, very famous fathers who sort of helped them get in the back door into the industry. So what are your thoughts on this? And is this something that you see changing going forward?
Yeah. I totally believe that statistic, and and I think that until we see those statistics on paper, we don't realize the extent in which it is so clear. I do, just having had seen a similar paradigm play out in Asia. I'm from Taiwan, so I've seen the same kind of trend of local orchestras in Asia wanting to hire foreign professionals because it, for lack of a better way of describing it, looks better. It's more marketable because there's a sense of there's a cosmetic reason, I think, for that. I'm not saying that's the reason why all organizations make those decisions, but I think that there is a sense of pursuing perhaps a certain status from involving foreign artists generally, and I mean, and I think it exists at a local level too. Like, I have a lot of artist friends who often say, like, they live in Boston, but their work is never in Boston because other areas, other cities want to hire people who are from other places in the country. For, again, I can't articulate the reason, but I think there is some sort of status seeking story there. And I don't know if it's essentially a problem, but I do think it's a phenomenon that's worth tracking and kind of seeing where it goes. I am, I think, naive in believing that, the excellent conducting is excellent conducting, excellent performance is excellent performance. So the people who deserve to be in certain places will fall into those places. Of course, the world doesn't work that way all the time, but I like to believe that it does. So, I guess I'm not generally as inclined to think about what you're talking about here, Matthew, as a problem, but more as just like an observation that's interesting to think about, and then to consider any alternative options, like parallel universes. Like, what if 100% of those positions were filled by American conductors? What would the landscape of our field look like? What would how would that impact the art that we make, or the trajectory that the orchestras are going in? I think lots of questions come out of your question rather than answers.
For sure.
Isn't that how it always is?
But I think it also goes back to what you were saying, that it's hard to change the status quo. And there have always been a preponderance of foreign-born conductors at the head of American orchestras. It's what people are used to. It's, in some ways, it's what people have come to expect. So
yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So along those lines, as you just mentioned, you are Taiwanese. How has that, if at all, affected your experience of your conducting career in the United States?
Honestly, I don't think that it has affected me that much, because I consider myself equally an American and from Taiwan. And I was born in Taiwan, and I spent the first 7 years of my life in Taiwan, which is not a lot. And I kind of moved back and forth a lot. And my immediate family is currently all in Taiwan. So I am actually proud of the country, its people, its culture, and its, its innovation, it being like so far ahead of, the US, for example, in terms of its like technology and things like that. But the US is where I've gone to school and where I'm establishing my career. So I really feel equally at home in both places. I think what that duality allows me is a multicultural identity that allows me to be not one-dimensional. And it allows me to really identify with people in both countries immediately. And I think that that's always a plus, because people feel, we gravitate towards the familiar, and having identity with Taiwan and the United States, it allows me to cast a wider net in reaching people and finding work, finding connections.
Yeah.
All of that.
Really quick follow-up to that. So you mentioned now several times we've talked about the gravitating towards the familiar. Something we've talked about a lot on the first 2 seasons of this podcast is incorporating more music by composers that have historically been ignored in the programming of the orchestras around the country and around the world, namely female composers and composers of color. And what is your take and what is your approach on incorporating this repertoire into the orchestral season in a way that audiences are going to be like, okay, I'm going to trust that this is going to be a good concert and I'm going to give this a try?
Yeah, I think programming must be so strategic because it must balance the familiar with the unfamiliar. And I think that when you strike that balance in terms of program order and the length of the works and how you market the concerts, I think you can make something great out of any program as long as there's thought and purpose behind it. So I'm not so much advocating for just one composer or just one piece of music, but I'm advocating for more thoughtfulness in using programming as a way of exposing both, I think, the orchestral musicians and the audiences in a way that really does not push people away because it's so unfamiliar, but at the same time doesn't just give them what they want, all of the familiar things. So it sounds like a cop-out of my response of like not really giving you an answer, but I think that feels like the most right answer for me, because I don't want to single any particular composer or group of composers out, because I think that it is up to, and also I'll add that as people, as artists, as musicians, we simply do not know what we don't know. So I can't always fault myself for not knowing XYZ composers because I just don't know them. But I can fault myself for not trying to get to know them. And I think that mindset is really important. In it's not just like, oh, well, I have these 5 composers that check the boxes of female and people of color or whatever it is, right? Or from this area of the world, and that's what I'm going to stick with. Like, I think that's also not the best approach either.
Yeah,
I think it's having So I think it's having the empathy to realize that other people know more than you do, and then seeking that information from other places.
Yeah, I think that's a really great, I mean, I think that's an answer that should be put into more of what we just do in life. I think if we all approach the way we communicate with others and navigate our spaces with just more intentionality, we would find that we are able to be more empathetic. We are able to learn more quicker. We are able to understand each other better. But oftentimes I find that people lack the intentionality of getting to know something or really listening. I think that is probably, feels like the root of a lot of the issue is this lack of intentionality in a lot of things that we do as a society, and really thinking things through before we say them or do them.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you just think about this conversation that we're having, or any conversation that you're having with somebody else, right? We think that we're listening, but we're just hearing. Yeah. And it's because, silence is really awkward. And when you're hearing, or when you're trying to come up with your response as the other person is talking, you are not really listening.
Yeah.
And that's something that I actually feel like that I have a long way to go in, that I always feel like I have to jump in and like respond right away. because, you know, I'm usually the teacher and I have to be in like the position of authority to put the person who knows the answers. And so like silence is challenging for me in terms of using it or allowing myself to use time after someone has asked me a question to just like think about the question and not to think about it as the person is asking me the question.
I use this phrase, I forget who told me this phrase, but it's this listening to understand, not listening to respond. And I feel a lot of times we're listening to respond. All right. So we're about halfway through our conversation. I'm wondering, Tiffany, if you have any things that you would like to recommend to our listeners, books, music, activities, anything that you think our listeners should be doing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just share something that I'm currently doing now, which is I'm reading a book called The Heart of Business by Hubert Joly. He's a Frenchman, businessman who is recently the CEO of Best Buy. And he was CEO, I think, from like 2012 to recently. And he wrote this book called The Heart of Business. And it is, so just to give you some context, Best Buy was not doing well when he came in, and they were being threatened by other major companies like Amazon and, you know, online retail that were threatening them to go out of business. And he came in and turned things around and helped the organization thrive, overcoming those challenges. And it's just really inspiring to hear his story on how he made that happen. And he advocates, you know, interestingly, for that companies have 3 imperatives, and that the imperatives are people, business, and finance. And in that order, that excellence on the first, the people, developing the fulfillment of the employees, the excellence on that is going to lead to excellence in business, which is loyal customers buying our products again and again, which is going to lead to excellence in finance, which is, you know, making money, right? And so that's his that's an idea that he's presented that I feel like is really worth sharing, because we often think that money is the goal, right? Or we want to make money as an organization, but, you know, he is talking about making money as an outcome and not the ultimate goal, and that the fulfillment and the development of its people in the organization is what comes first. And that's so counterintuitive, because we think that the people work for us and we make money, right? And we think that we're serving them because we make money so that we could pay them. But actually, you know, there has been very little thought that goes into inspiring people and how the company can help them discover their purpose or help them achieve their dreams. And I think that's, you know, focusing on purpose and the people and the human relationships and not on the profit, because the profit is a result of taking care of the people. I think that's something that we can really learn a lot from in our industry.
That is a great segue to the next thing we wanted to talk about, which is indeed your blog, Conductor as CEO. You have identified that there is a widespread workplace dissatisfaction among musicians in the professional orchestra world. How did you initially identify this problem, and what inspired you to start your blog, and what have you learned from it?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to share. You know, I don't think that I discovered the problem. The problem was there. And it actually, I came across this study from the mid 1990s where they surveyed they surveyed job satisfaction rates across many industries. And they ranked the job satisfaction rates, and they discovered that orchestral musicians were pretty low on that ranking, and that orchestral musicians were actually ranked lower than the job satisfaction of prison guards and of flight attendants. Like flight attendants, prison guards, and then orchestral musicians. And I think that there were like, 7, 8, 9 on a list of 12. So it's like, it was interesting, that made me think about, okay, well, that it was a problem 30 years ago. And what, from my own experience, having conducted, worked with students, worked with professionals, I can definitely see that is still a problem, because I think that we go into work, we think that we go into work because we love playing our instruments, but actually we go into work to make money. And I think that we can lose sight of why we were there in the first place. And so what I was most surprised about in this study is not like the actual statistic itself, because I kind of, from my experience, I can understand why. But I was so surprised at like what the recommendations were to help musicians improve their job satisfaction. So before I do that, I have to preface it by saying that this, a lot of times in all industries, the low job satisfaction is a result of 3 reasons. And the 3 reasons are no control over the work environment. Like, as musicians, we don't have any control of where we rehearse, how long we rehearse, where we have our concerts, things like that. Number 2, that there's no autonomy in how we do the work. So we don't have autonomy in the sense of, well, we have to play what's on the page, but beyond that, we do what a conductor says to do. So we don't really have a lot of choices, even though we're artists. We don't have a lot of choices in the orchestral context. So we have no autonomy. And number 3 is that there's no ability to speak up, that there's a lot of fear within just whether we can play the right notes at the right times and the right dynamic and all of that, but also the fact that we are conflict averse. So we don't want to disagree with what the conductor is saying, or we don't want to disagree with a new policy. So we don't speak up because we are afraid, or because we are afraid. So there are these 3 reasons cited for lack of job satisfaction. And so the study basically was said that, you don't have any control over the work environment. Well, go find a hobby where you can have control over the work environment, like pick up gardening. Or, you don't have any autonomy over your work. Go take up another hobby like flying planes. And they actually said, well, this is why a lot of musicians become pilots. It's because they feel like they have autonomy over their work. So I found that to be really interesting, because it was in a way treating the symptom and not the disease itself. And this is 30 years ago, and I don't think that we have actually gone very far, simply because we don't think of it as a problem. And so I became really interested in leadership ideas in the business industries, because I'm a nerd and like to read those things. And I realized that all of these people were talking about change and focusing on work culture, improving work culture in the workplace for the employees. They were talking about psychological safety. How do you allow people to feel like that they're trusted and that they are safe to speak up? And how do we use purpose to infuse a sense of fulfillment in the work that we do? So people in other industries are talking about these things and have been for the last decade or so, and they've actually made strides, improvements in how they treat their employees, how they curate workplaces, how they infuse purpose. And I just feel like that we're really not doing so much of that in our industry, and that I wanted to apply some of the ideas that I was learning in the other industries into my work as an artistic leader. I think from when I first started conducting, I knew that I wanted to serve the people. And this helped me articulate why I care, what my work is meant to do, who my work is for, and what is the impact and the change that I'm seeking to make with my work.
There's a quote on your website that dissolving fears within a leader, and this idea of that versus a group dichotomy. Can you kind of dissect that a little bit for us? Because I think that's a really powerful kind of phrase.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the conductor versus ensemble dichotomy is the norm. It's what's familiar, and it's become, I think, the center of our working relationship / dynamic. And it's a problem not just with the music industry, but with all other industries, with the leader versus group, right? The leader's always right. We're trained that the leader is always right. The teacher is always right. I mean, we started from school saying that the teacher's always right, right? That the teacher has all the answers. And there's the assumption that conductors are always right. And do what the conductor says, and just do your job and everything will be fine. And it's interesting because I am a conductor, but I've also played in orchestras as a cellist. So I know that conductors are trained to deal with disgruntled musicians, that we're taught to expect disgruntled as a default, and how to mitigate that with, motivation, with how we run our rehearsals and how we use our time, all of that. And I also know that musicians are given advice and pointers about how to deal with conductors. And mostly the advice is ignore them, right? And don't talk back. We're saying, we want to hear your ideas. We want to hear from you, but only if you agree with us and play our game, or you will be punished. And that does not bode well for what, in the business industry, we're talking about psychological safety, about feeling safe to speak up, regardless of whether you disagree or agree, and so over time, I think as musicians, we get out of practice in thinking for ourselves musically. Like, the people who are sitting in the orchestra thinks, oh, the conductor's going to tell me what to do. So I'm not going to really think about how to phrase this, because, I mean, they do. I'm not saying that they don't think about how to phrase things, but there's a certain expectation from the information to come from the conductor. And the conductor also expects for them to be the all-knowing being, the person who has to disseminate that information. And so so we end up having a lack of collaboration, the lack of speaking up from the people who are in the group. And we don't have practice of having ideas for ourselves. We don't take risks in our playing and in our improvements in our organizations, because we're just afraid.
So you've realized all of this. You've thought a lot about it. You've thought a lot about the symptoms in your practice as a conductor with the groups that you work with. What are some things that you've done actively, some active decisions, changes that you've made in your practice as a conductor when working with orchestras to try to mitigate or fix some of these issues?
Yeah, I think one of the first things that I've had to do is to show vulnerability. I've had to show that I do not have all the answers. I don't know all the solutions, and I need their help. And I think one of the most important things that a leader can say is, I don't know, and I screwed that up if it's your fault, right? And those are so powerful because it allows the group, whether they're students or employees or, that it allows them to see that you are a human being that is not perfect. And it gives them the ability to say to themselves, I can be vulnerable, I can be not perfect, and it's okay. So I think being a leader, I've really forced myself, at first I had to force myself to be the leader in showing vulnerability and doing that first. Then if I don't do that, then the musicians are never going to feel safe to feel that way too. And then the next step that I've taken is to include the musicians as much as possible in crowdsourcing ideas for change. So I've only started thinking about this in the last 7 months or so. So I feel like I have implemented ideas in the past, but not in a very systematic way. So and then of course COVID happened, so I didn't really have a chance to really fully implement the ideas. So I've been mostly writing about it, but in the times in which I have been able to implement, I have asked the musicians for constant feedback in terms of what they want to play, why they want to play it, And this is in the context of an academic institution, so actually there's a little more space, freedom for that to happen. What they want to play, how they want to play it, and also to give themselves the space to help each other. So one example is that right before one of our recording sessions during COVID, I asked my orchestra to spend 2 minutes with their music, picking up the music, going to somebody else in the room who's not me, and telling them about a challenge or a problem that they've been having on the music, and having the partner give them some advice about how they can overcome that challenge. And it's a 2-minute exercise, and they just swapped, one person told the other person about their challenge, and then the other person gave some advice, and then they did vice versa. And my hope is to give them more agency and more empowerment in terms of that they actually have the solutions to solve the problems that they've had. They do not have to wait for me to say, oh, you're having trouble with that rhythm there. Here are 5 solutions for you, right? But actually they have solutions themselves. And to get that out of them is actually really hard. So I did this exercise, it only took 2 minutes, to get them to just say like, oh, I can help that person. Maybe I can help myself the next time. And I don't have to wait until the rehearsal. And actually what it did was it was right before a recording session. So it wasn't a rehearsal, but it made that recording session so much better. And I didn't even have to do anything. And it's just because they were thinking about their challenges, and they felt empowered to overcome them. And what it did was I didn't need to rehearse anything, because they rehearsed it themselves in their minds as they were having these conversations. And so I actually didn't have to rehearse as much as if I didn't have them do that exercise.
I think you mentioned this, and this kind of I'm going to kind of think about 2 things here together, but from a young age, you mentioned that we are taught about not making mistakes or being perfect or trying to be perfect and always striving for perfection and keep practicing and you'll get it eventually and all this stuff. And it starts very young, and then you go to conservatory, and then you're in an ensemble, and then you get tenure, and then, it's a huge problem. But this idea of constantly striving for perfection in a world that is inherently imperfect and will never be so can very much lead to mental health issues. And I know that in our youth orchestra, we see so many young people just striving to be perfect and beating themselves up over making mistakes. And especially during COVID, when we were doing recordings and they would send us a recording, like, it's not perfect. We're like, it's not going to be. But I can see it affecting young people's mental health. And so I wonder what your take is on that, and why it kind of reinforces why this is so important to not only our young people, but our professional musicians as well. But I wonder what maybe your experience or how you've seen this impact some young people's enjoyment actually in the rehearsal.
Yeah. Well, I think perfectionism is something that has traditionally prevented us from taking action, doing things, or inaction, because we are actually scared of just being bad, right? We're afraid of the feeling of failing, so we avoid it. And I am coming to think more about this idea. It's not my idea, but there's this idea that perfectionism is actually a form of hiding and procrastination. And we're hiding from not wanting to feel bad. We're procrastinating the feeling of feeling bad when we fail. So we avoid it at all costs, and we don't share it because it's not ready. And so we delay sharing the thing, right? And I'm guilty of that too. And this is an idea that I think has really changed my mindset over time. I heard this, I think, about a year ago. It's an idea that Seth Godin speaks a lot about. And I think that you're right, Rachel, that the truth is that it's never going to be perfect. So why are we delaying? Why are we waiting? Why are we being inactive? And I think that we just are so overcome by the fear of failing. And so I think to address it is to say, what can we do about failure? How can we rethink failure? And, and also just to think that, that aiming for outstanding performance is a great thing, but expecting human perfection is not. You can strive to be outstanding and excellent, but you should not strive to be perfect, because humans are not perfect.
Yeah, it's a fascinating take on perfectionism that I really never considered before. And I have thought, though, about how there are some recordings that you hear, particularly live recordings, where it'll just be an electrifying performance that's not technically perfect. And it's better to listen to than a studio recording where everything is so perfectly polished. There's something about when people are not afraid to take a risk, because they know that if something goes wrong, the audience in the hall is probably going to forget about it, and no one who wasn't there is ever going to know it happened. There's something special about a live performance where the orchestra is really encouraged to take risks and not be afraid if it's not all 100% perfect.
Yeah, that's so true. And it's so counterintuitive to what we do in like the practice room and the rehearsal room, right? I feel like we don't practice taking the risks, and we wait to do it. If we even do it, we wait to do it in the concert space, and it's too late. And so I've been thinking a lot about how do we encourage this risk taking. And I'll share this one thought that I've been thinking a lot about, is that, we think of failure as as black and white, right? You either succeeded or you failed. And when we fail, it's like bad, 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 punishment. And we get, and what are we afraid of when we are making a mistake? We're afraid of being embarrassed. We're afraid of being rejected, and we're afraid of losing our jobs, or losing our jobs, or losing our place in the group of belonging, like being shunned, right? And so, so I think that we just don't want to make mistakes. But there's a psychologist who talks about that there are actually two kinds of failures. There is a praiseworthy failure, and there is a blameworthy failure. And praiseworthy failures are failures that are a result from experimentation and complexity. So things that you're trying to do to take risks, and you just failed as a result. Blameworthy failures are because of incompetence or inattention. Like you just simply did not do you were not prepared for the rehearsal, or something like, or you didn't practice, right? And those are very different. But she encourages us to, this is a psychologist called Amy Edmondson, and she encourages us to think about how many times do we treat the praiseworthy failures like they are blameworthy failures. And that is, I think, a really worthy idea to think about, is how do we praise the failures that are praiseworthy?
Right. And yeah, and ultimately encouraging that in the professional space is going to be when someone figures out the best way to do that, it's going to be a revolutionary event in our profession.
Yeah, because it completely turns the table around. And in giving, I think it's in giving the people who are scared to make mistakes or fail, gives them the responsibility of aiming for failure in a weird way, like aiming to expand their boundaries, and for it to be okay to fail as a result of that expansion.
So we've talked a lot about workplace satisfaction in the orchestral world. And so just asking you, what is a time that you have most enjoyed what you do, where you have felt the most satisfied with your work?
I think I enjoyed when the experiences where my work had a great impact on the people that I work with. When I'm able to make them happier at work, or think about the music differently, to understand why they're playing what they're playing, it just makes the work more meaningful for them, and it makes me feel good about my having helped them. And the best times are, of course, when they tell me in person that they have how they have changed as a result of working with me. You know, whether it's you made me listen more, or you made me think differently, or I've never been so excited to play these like 3 pages of eighth notes, you know, or you know, time went by really fast in the rehearsal. That's a frequent comment for me. And so I think when I'm able to help people get into flow of their work and understand why they're working, and to have to just be happier to be there, that I think is when I've enjoyed my work the most.
I wrote down the question, how do you think these issues affect diversity in our field? And I think I have a small idea that has kind of popped into my head kind of throughout the conversation, of this idea of not taking risks, or not speaking up, or not feeling safe to speak up in a space. So I'm wondering kind of your take on that question, whether it come to the repertoire we choose, or who's in the orchestras, or who's even going to school for this kind of thing. This entire conversation has kind of made me think about this question very differently than I think when I wrote it, about how this issue specifically affects the diversity that we see on stages and in our field.
Right. Yeah. I think you're right that it boils down to people not being feeling like that they're able to speak up. And I think you can have a lot of diversity in your organization, but if those people are not willing to, if those people are not they don't feel safe to speak up, then it doesn't really help that much, you know, and sort of more a cosmetic thing. And you know, what you just said reminds me of a quote that I think a lot about, that inclusion drives diversity and not the other way around. So just because your group is diverse does not mean that you're being inclusive, because some people may still not be able to speak up, and you may not be giving them the space to speak up or the permission to speak up. But if you include people, all kinds of people, to share their ideas, to speak up, then the diversity comes as a result. You know, and that I think diversity comes not just in where people are from or the color of their skin, but it comes from diversity of thought, diversity of experience, diversity of social backgrounds. And that is beyond color of skin, you know, or what country they're from. So I think of diversity as a bigger scope, within a larger scope, than I think what we're thinking, what, you know, we traditionally have been thinking about diversity in the last 2 years.
So our podcast is called Orchestrating Change. So we always ask every guest at the end of every episode, what are some of your thoughts on how we orchestrate change?
Yeah, I have some quick thoughts. I think doing the hard things, going towards the fears, doing the thing that you've been procrastinating doing because you were scared. That's, you know, the first thing, I think. And I think that every other point that I'm going to talk about is probably going to be hard. So it's accepting that change is hard, and we have to commit to failing and maybe not getting it right the first time. And so my first thing that I want to talk about is asking good questions, because I think that sometimes we work really hard to solve problems, but we don't solve the right problems. And so it's asking good questions with different perspectives, different people with different backgrounds, different worldviews, getting other people to help you, whether you are an individual or you are an organization, see your blind spots. Asking the questions to figure out what the real problems are. Second thing is uniting people through purpose and core values. That's something that I really believe in. I think that if we are clear about our personal and our organizational values and purpose, then we can attract and get the right people on the bus to go to where we want to go. So I think this requires a reform in rethinking our mission statements, how we use that, and how we reform our hiring practices to infuse values and purpose within that. And I think aligning individual purpose what people's dreams and wishes and hopes are, what they want to change in the world, and the purpose of the organization. If we can find a way to align those through conversations, through hiring practices, through thinking, rethinking missions, that is going to do so much for just the industry as a whole. The third thing is to motivate differently. And what I mean by that is, we expect people to, or there's this idea that we expect people to not like their jobs. So we put carrots and sticks in place to motivate them, right? And I think that for the arts, we get confused a little bit, because we think that because we love what we do for a living, that we must love our jobs. But sometimes we can lose sight of why we're doing what we're doing, and we lose sight of why we fell in love with the artwork in the first place. So carrots and sticks do not work if someone has lost that sense of purpose. So my last thing is kind of what I've been talking about throughout this entire conversation, is this practicing empathy. I think if we practice more empathy and realize that nobody sees the world the way that you do, we can start to see what we don't see and figure out our blind spots, and then work more collaboratively and have the right conversations to discover the right problems and come up with the solutions together, so we can actually make change happen.
Fantastic. Well, that's a lot to digest, a lot to leave our listeners with, and us ourselves for us to think about going forward. But
it's really, I think that's just good leadership, I think. And it's something that I'm going to have to go back and listen to some of this again, because I think that it's really important for classical music and for moving us forward, but also just for people and leaders in the field of all fields. So, yeah.
Tiffany Chang, it's been an absolute delight to speak with you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking all the great questions, and for having me here, for having this conversation. I really hope that I've given you more than enough to think about. So at least, one thing will stick and go somewhere.
Tiffany Chang, conductor and creator of the blog Conductor as CEO.
Orchestrating Change is a production of the Canton Symphony Orchestra.
Our theme music was composed by Eric Gould and performed by Derek Snyder and Tim Adams.
Our audio engineer and mixer is Nathan Maslick, with video and audio editing by Shoreline Media.
Thank you for listening, and see you next time.